Well, again, I thank you for giving me an opportunity to come and talk about the work of Cross Ministries. I'd like to share a little bit of my experiences. Cindy and her husband, Stephen, are your average hardworking Americans. They try to do all the right things in life. Stephen's a stand-up guy, and he works as a carpenter and general laborer to try and support his family. And Cindy works part-time in a temp service. The reason why she works part-time is because she's trying to keep a little more flexible hours. Their son Joshua was born with an array of health problems, including chronic asthma. And they have to have frequent doctor's visits and appointments, so she has to leave her schedule open a little bit to be able to take him to these many doctor's visits. And like most families, their dream is to own their own home. But right now, they're just struggling, living paycheck to paycheck, just trying to get by. So I met Cindy when she came to my office at Cross Ministries, and she was there to ask for some help in paying their rent. They had just received some bad news. Stephen had been diagnosed with cancer in his lymph nodes, and he was undergoing chemo and radiation treatments. And because of that, he wasn't able to do the work that he is most qualified to do. And to the family's credit, they had been keeping up with their bills. They had been able to pay the electric and the water. They had made most of their expenses, but they just didn't have enough money to pay the full month's rent. And the landlord said that he wouldn't accept a partial payment. And an eviction was going to be in their future if Cross Ministries could not come to be able to help them out. Cindy had been making choices all month. Should she buy food or put gas in the car to help them get back and forth to the doctor's appointments or to her job? Should she pay the utility bill or the rent, knowing that if the electricity was turned off, the food in the refrigerator would spoil and the window air conditioner unit wouldn't work, which would probably end up triggering another asthma attack for her son? In a well-written book titled Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City, the author Matthew Desmond wrote that poverty is a little bit about being poor, but it's a lot about being excluded. And the most important thing that people get excluded from is good options when they have to make hard choices. Choices between rent and health care, rent and school supplies, or even choices between food and putting gas in the car to get to work to make enough money to pay the rent. Poor people have to make many times the number of choices that a person with even a little bit of money faces. And they can't get any of them wrong. The author Desmond found that in the face of falling incomes, soaring housing costs, and insufficient affordable rental properties for low-income people, eviction has become more commonplace in America than ever before. In Polk County, there's an average of 13 evictions filed every day of the year. A sheriff has to have a full-time staff devoted to carrying out these evictions. And within the context of my work at Cross Ministries, I know that we can reasonably assume that for every eviction filed, there were several more households where simply the threat of a filing, the threat of a black mark on the renter's record severely curtailing their ability to rent from future landlords, was enough to force compliance, to force people to move out, to force people not to complain about substandard living conditions, refrigerators or stoves that don't work, broken water pipes, toilets that back up, mold on the walls, rats underfoot, and broken window or door locks. In other words, for a family to do absolutely anything to avoid being evicted. The fear of a landlord's retribution was never more evident than the day I worked with a young family from Burma. It was a mother, father, and their one-year-old daughter. And the initial reason that they came to my office was that the father had lost his job and they were seeking help with a rent payment. The family had first gone to Polk County General Assistance, which is the process for them to apply for some help, but they were denied because the husband had lost his job, which made him ineligible for assistance from the county. Yeah. In the course of working with Mun and his family, I read in the paperwork that in addition to paying the rent, the family were also required to pay $32,032.93 to the landlord because of a fire that occurred at the property. Now, this seemed a little strange to me. I hadn't encountered that in the past. So I took a few extra minutes to try and figure out, what was going on and why they would have to pay $32,000. And Mun said that while he and his wife were at the hospital visiting a sick friend, an electrical fire started in the wall of their apartment, in the kitchen wall, in their absence. The landlord told them that because they didn't have renter's insurance, they would have to reimburse the landlord for the full cost of this fire. The property manager then asked him how much he was planning to pay him each month extra, to make up this $32,000. And Mun said that the most he could come up with was $300 a month, and it was going to making some incredibly difficult choices for that family. They would have to cut back on food, diapers for the child, and many other basic necessities. But Mun would do whatever he had to do to avoid this eviction. At the point at which the family came to my office, they'd actually been making that extra payment for a year, and they would have gone on making this payment indefinitely had Mun not lost his job and ended up in my office. I asked him if the landlord was at least giving them a receipt for the money that they paid, and he said the landlord did not. They had been threatened that if they did not make this payment, it would destroy their credit forever. They'd never be able to purchase a car or rent another apartment in the entire United States of America. They would be homeless. And frightened for his family's well-being, Mun started making the extra payments to the landlord every month, even though he hadn't been responsible for this electrical fire. In spite of being terrified of the landlord's retribution, after talking with Mun for a while, he finally let me put a cautious phone call into legal aid. I talked with them, I gave them the entire scenario. They agreed that it sounded a little hinky, and we did, set up an arrangement for him to go in and talk with them. Many of us have long assumed that being evicted was a result of poverty. But we now know that eviction is also a cause of poverty. One eviction can be enough to spiral a family downward and out of control. When people are evicted, they often lose everything, including their belongings, access to their benefits, their job, even their children. And so people live in fear of being evicted, and partly because of that fear, the deck is stacked against the poor. All too often, the laws are written by and for those who have the most influence, and not to protect God's least of these. Sadly, 1 in 4 families who qualify for housing assistance receive help. Only 1 in 4 receive help due to budget cuts, and that means that 3 out of 4 are left to struggle on their own. Statistics tell us that for the majority of low-income families, at least half of the income goes for housing costs, and 1 in 4 are spending more than 70% of their income just to pay the rent and keep the utilities on. Additionally, the poorest families spend 35% or more of their income on food, while the majority of us spend just 7 to 15% of our income at the grocery store. The percentage declines as families get wealthier, even as the actual dollars spent goes up. Consider also that there has been a rise in people living on approximately $2 per day who exist in abject poverty. The author Barbara Ehrenreich, when talking about the phenomenon of living on $2 a day, said affluent Americans often cherish the belief that poverty in America is far more comfortable than poverty in the rest of the world. But this is world-class poverty. Precarious work, if there's work at all, with few protections provided by defunded regulatory mechanisms, and tenants who are afraid to report landlords because they can and do evict punitively. Poverty is not only about not having enough money, it's also about not having access to the culture. We can see that our culture has changed over the years. And this is recognized in some pretty demonstrable ways. In Evicted, the author holds up a story about eviction during a different time period. He explains that there was a time when an eviction was a community event. The whole town would show up, and when that sheriff's deputies carried all the family's furniture out of that house, the whole town would rally and they would carry that furniture right back in again. The sheriff didn't much like doing the eviction, and he didn't put up much resistance to the will of the crowd. The understanding at that time was that the landlord was wealthy and could afford to find other solutions. But today's landlords are in similarly precarious positions and often mortgaged to the bank. Landlords themselves are often living paycheck to paycheck or renter's check to renter's check. And by all means, not all landlords are slumlords. Certainly, Polk County and surrounding counties have wonderful rental units that are well tended. But for a percentage of the low-income population, there are some really significant housing challenges. The Des Moines Register's watchdog columnist Lee Rood turned a spotlight on some of our community's more notorious landlords in a recent article on the crisis of rundown rentals in the metro area. And she referenced several landlords, one of whom owns 218 properties, of which almost half are nearly unlivable. Yet, desperate people continue to rent from him. All the landlords noted are landlords that I encounter on a regular basis. Within the faith community, homelessness prevention services, such as those offered by Cross Ministries, work diligently to prevent people teetering on the edge from falling. We also work to empower families to have a voice, to connect people to the resources they need, and to change systemic housing problems. Cross Ministries works daily with people to address a range of basic needs, providing more than 21,000 acts of service annually, including rent and utility assistance, emergency food, personal hygiene supplies, and laundromat vouchers so people can maintain basic cleanliness. One of our favorite programs will be held on Saturday, August 5th, and that's our back to school giveaway. It's our 25th year of doing the event, and I know concretely that you have heard a lot about this because Joyce is sitting right there, and I know she's been she's been nudging for those volunteers, and by golly, we need every volunteer that we can get. And you already know, but for every $15 donation, a child from a low-income family can have the school supplies that they need to start their academic year. And this program is just a classic way of strengthening education to level the playing field. But you know, we need more. We need more structural solutions that acknowledge our economy has changed. The economy was meant to serve the culture, but it seems to have gotten turned around. As a society, it's important that all people be allowed to participate and be included in the mainstream. Poverty is more than just not having enough money. It's always been more complicated than that. But when there's no money for basic human needs, a person can't focus elsewhere. Solving poverty and homelessness lets our whole society thrive. And the change starts with us. The change starts with one act of service, making a difference, one act of service at a time. To quote the Reverend Martin Luther King, ultimately, a great nation is a compassionate nation. America has not met its obligation and its responsibilities to the poor. One day, we will have to stand before the God of history, and we'll talk in terms of things we've done. Yes, we will be able to say that we have built gargantuan bridges to span the seas. We've built gigantic buildings to kiss the skies. It seems that I can hear the God of history saying, "That was not enough, but I was hungry, and you fed me not, and I was naked, and you clothed me not, and I was devoid of a decent sanitary house to live in, and you provided no shelter for me." And Dr. King said, "This is America's opportunity to help bridge the gulf between the haves and have-nots. The question remains, what will America do?" Amen.